This is the first in the current Thrawn Trilogy that started in April of 2016 and is concluding near the end of this month, which of course is why I'm reading through and reviewing the first two books now. For a little background, because I'd like to start my videos by saying for a little background, I read through the original Thrawn Trilogy probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was a big fan of it, and while I really liked Thrawn, there's definitely a lot more to him in this book, which obviously I'll get to, but I'm not sure that I would put this book quite up with maybe any of the original trilogy, which isn't a slight on it. I love those books. First of all, Thrawn is the best he's ever been in this book because it's focused on him. Whereas, while the original was called the Thrawn Trilogy, it was called that because he was the main antagonist, as opposed to being the main character. We did get a decent amount of time with him to explore how he is and his character to some extent, how he uses art to piece together the mental dynamics of different races and predict their movements, which is actually one thing that the original trilogy went into more, at least more than the first book. I suppose that could change by the time I've read the third book, or maybe even the second, is that they tackle him using art to predict what different races and different groups will do. However, they don't go into nearly as much detail exploring what exactly in the art makes those connections, whereas in the original trilogy, there'd be minor diatribes about him going into detail about the art and how he feels, how details about the art connect to what he expects out of his opponents, whereas we kind of just know that he does that in this first book. Though, like I said, I generally enjoy Thrawn more in this book, and we do get a lot more of him. He's maybe a third or a quarter of the attention in the original books, maybe even less, honestly. Because in the original books, there's a bunch of different plot lines going on. They're not all happening at the same time, but there's always more than one at the very least, though they are balanced very well. You have the Luke and Mara subplot, which is probably the biggest one in the books. You have Leia / sometimes Han dealing with political stuff, and then later on dealing with the overarching Thrawn thing. You have the subplot with the old crazy ex-Jedi whose name I can't remember, that I believe starts with a J. He's on the cover of one of the books. And the conclusion to the trilogy is more of a basic Star Wars plot. I'm not complaining about the original trilogy in the slightest. There's a lot going on there, and of course because of that, Thrawn kind of takes a back seat. Not really, but and learning not just how he thinks, but why he thinks that way, and just learning more of him and seeing him interact in more unique situations is something we couldn't really get in the original trilogy, because it also had to be a big, sweeping bunch of things going on at once Star Wars narrative, which isn't exactly a negative, but did impact his character. This is kind of an origin story, but not really. It's more an origin of his career path and also his life within the Empire and within the core world. We get to see him apply to the academy, rise up through the ranks, graduate, prove himself against a lot of bigotry and racism, which is logically not all that consistent with a galaxy that's been for many thousands of years so free roaming, but is an established thing within the Empire. So I'm cool with it, and it's played really well. We actually see him struggle a lot more in this book than probably all of the original trilogy, because he gets more screen time. More things happen, more negative things have the opportunity to happen. Whereas pretty much the only time we saw him mess up in the original trilogy was like right at the end where he lost. But one thing that surprised me about this book, while the focus is definitely Thrawn, I'd say 80%, maybe 75% of the book is focused on Thrawn. We also get a new character who's often around Thrawn, so it doesn't really take much away from, is Eli Vanto, who is a very interesting, very likable, and very good character that is one of the better ones I've seen introduced into the Star Wars canon in a long time, who serves as an aide for Thrawn when he first arrives in the Empire, and you kind of get to see his growth alongside Thrawn and sometimes separate of Thrawn, and you get to see him develop the characteristics and traits of a very impressive Imperial officer himself. And it's very rewarding when you actually get to see him succeed, possibly more so than Thrawn, because Thrawn has so many natural talents. But also, probably 20% of the rest of the book focuses on Governor Miranda Price from Star Wars Rebels, who is the governor of Lothal that initially brings Thrawn in to try to help her quell the uprising on Lothal within Rebels, which is very interesting, and I actually wasn't a fan of it first. That's part of why I don't like this book as much. While there were some other parts, even with Thrawn, that weren't all that interesting, but the most boring parts were the initial stuff with Governor Price, because you kind of just see her living her life and hanging out with her friends, which I'm all for. There's not a whole lot of action in this book at all, but I still really like it. The problem is that her friends aren't very interesting. Some of the political stuff she gets into is interesting in the beginning and gets a lot more interesting later on, but it's also not that great, and some of it's really boring. So that was a disappointing lull in the almost midway point of the book, so that brings it down. But by the end of it, I was really enjoying the stuff that follows her. The little bit of interaction we get establishing the relationship between Price and Thrawn is pretty entertaining too. So while I don't like this book, I don't think as much as I liked any of the original trilogy. I think it actually has a huge amount of space to grow, and the writing was absolutely top notch. The writing is definitely better here than it was in the original trilogy, which it's a 10 compared to like a 9. So I mean, the original was still great, but this is definitely a Timothy Zahn who knows this character better and has been writing for over 20 years since he last wrote the character. But I really look forward to reading the second book, which I'll probably end up reviewing later this month. And hopefully I'm not too burnt out by then, that I'll end up going through the third book pretty quickly after it comes out. But if not, I apologize in advance. And there are probably a bunch of other people who will make better reviews anyway. So